Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In this video, I'm going to show an example of the press taking one piece of information and building a fictional story around it. 7 years ago, Scientific American wrote this article. Exxon knew about climate change almost 40 years ago. A new investigation shows the oil company understood the science before it became a public issue and spent millions to promote misinformation. Exxon was aware of climate change as early as 1977, 11 years before it became a public issue, according to a recent investigation from Inside Climate News. This knowledge did not prevent the company from spending decades refusing to acknowledge climate change and even promoting climate misinformation, an approach many have likened to the lies spread by the tobacco industry. Basically, Scientific American is saying that 45 years ago, Exxon engaged in a conspiracy to destroy the climate in exchange for money. That was a really nice conspiracy theory from Scientific American, but I was in college during the 1970s and I remember it very well. Here's an article from 1979. During the 1970s, the CIA was warning everybody about global cooling. The CIA was warning about a cooler and hungrier world. 50 years ago today, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University, and then they sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. If they were correct, we would be halfway to the new ice age. This was the cover of Science News on March 1st, 1975. The ice age cometh. And they showed glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. In November 1976, National Geographic and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration were warning about cooling which had occurred since the 1940s. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. The U.S. National Science Board said, during the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first, but more sharply over the last decade. New York Times, January 5, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. Time magazine warns of another ice age, and they blamed global cooling for drought, floods, and other bizarre and unpredictable weather. The Guardian said, space satellites show new ice age coming fast. The satellites showed that snow and ice cover of the Earth increased by 12% during 1967 to 1972. This is fascinating because government agencies now claim they don't have satellite sea ice data prior to 1979. This is another Orwellian rewrite of history by government agencies, which I discussed in yesterday's video. In 1981, the Chicago Tribune wrote, climatologists now blame recurring droughts and floods on a global cooling trend that could trigger massive tragedies for mankind. This article from 1989 was very important and will be the topic of a separate video. Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Tom Carl of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Climatic Data Center. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. In spite of all the well-publicized concern about global warming, you must understand that there is still considerable uncertainty among scientific experts about a number of critical factors which determine global warming, said the NOAA administrator. As I said, this will be the topic of another video, but let's look at this statement. Earth actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. That's what NOAA was saying in 1989. But NOAA has altered the data. Now they show 0.4 C warming from 1921 to 1979. But in 1989, they said the Earth cooled during that period. This is called policy-based evidence making. They have a policy they want to implement, and they make up fake data to support it. Scientific American is trying to say that Exxon knew in 1977 that CO2 emissions from the burning of their products were going to destroy the planet. But the CIA thought the world was cooling. 42 top investigators thought the world was cooling and that we were headed towards a new ice age. And they said the cooling had a natural cause. Science News thought the world was cooling. The United States National Science Board thought the world was cooling. An international team of specialists in the New York Times thought the Northern Hemisphere was cooling with no end in sight. And 12 years later, in 1989, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said there was still considerable uncertainty about global warming. So let's take a look at how Scientific American created this fictional story. People have been talking about global warming for a very long time. Greta's ancestor, Svante Arrhenius, was talking about global warming during the 19th century. In 1913, he was predicting 8 to 9 degrees Celsius warming and that Greenland would have a good climate for farming, like they did during the medieval warm period, which Michael Mann erased. He predicted cotton would be a stable crop in Iowa, bananas will fringe the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, Siberia will become the greatest farming country in the world. There have been people making these kinds of predictions for well over a century. Exxon had one person in 1977 parroting the same nonsense, and Scientific American wants people to believe that it was a huge conspiracy to ignore him. The reality is that it was just part of an ongoing debate which had been going on for a very long time. There wasn't any big secret at Exxon. Let's take a look at what else was going on in 1913 at the time Arrhenius was making these predictions. On July 10, 1913, California set the world's record temperature of 134 degrees Fahrenheit, which has never been matched since. Easter week 1913 was probably the worst weather week in U.S. history. 7 days of tornadoes, blizzards, and floods devastated much of the United States. This is what the Washington Post reported on their front page. Flood, flames, famine spread a pall of horror over cities of misery and suffering. There were lots of very bad tornadoes that week, but the worst one was in Omaha, Nebraska, where the city was largely destroyed. Flooding like this was seen over much of the eastern half of the United States during Easter week 1913. Scientific American wants people to believe that lowering CO2 levels would lead to better weather, but the historical record provides no evidence to support that superstition. Now let's take a look at what was actually going on in 1977. The winters of 1977, 1978, and 1979 were three of the coldest on record in the United States. In January of 1977, it snowed in Miami, the only time that's ever happened there. Buffalo, New York was buried under 10 feet of snow during January 1977. But Scientific American wants people to believe that Exxon was hiding some big secret that they knew the planet was overheating. The reality is that if oil and gas companies stopped delivering their product, billions of people would be dead within months. Oil and gas companies keep us alive and keep us comfortable. By contrast, climate alarmists contribute nothing but high energy prices and fuel poverty. Oil and gas companies aren't evil, but magazines like this one, which publish climate propaganda, are doing tremendous damage to the human race. These people contribute nothing, and they're parasites sucking trillions of dollars out of the economy. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this climate racketeering operation for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki, Upala, Zen, Ruby, Sakura, and one puppy who's yet to be named at realclimatescience.com.